1:15 in the morning, June 6, 1944. In a German command bunker on the Cotentin Peninsula, the air is thick with stale smoke and the false quiet of a front line under an unsteady truce with the weather. Then, the field telephones begin to shriek. The first reports are bizarre, almost laughable. A lone parachutist seen descending near Carentan, a single glider landing in a moonlit field miles away. Anomalies, ghosts. The duty officers treat them as such, stray Allied commandos or perhaps panicked observations from sentries seeing shadows in the dark. But then the anomalies become a cascade. The calls multiply, each one more frantic and less coherent than the last. From a coastal battery near Saint-Vaast-le-Hougue, a sergeant screams into the receiver about men dropping from the sky, not in formations, but scattered like seeds thrown to the wind. From a checkpoint outside Sainte-Mère-Église, a lieutenant reports gunfire erupting from 3 directions at once. The map on the command table, meant to show a clear and ordered battlefield, begins to look like a canvas splattered with random ink blots. There is no spearhead, no discernible objective. It is the geometry of madness. For a German soldier like Grenadier Klaus Richter, huddled behind a hedgerow, the experience was a descent into psychological horror. The enemy was not a line of men charging from the front. The enemy was a whisper in the darkness behind him. A strange metallic clicking sound, like a child's toy, answered by another from a different direction. A burst of fire would erupt from a ditch they had cleared only minutes before. They were not fighting an army, they were attempting to fight a phantom. A report from one squad leader to his company commander captured the feeling of utter helplessness. They are everywhere. We clear a road, and 5 minutes later, they are firing at us from the same spot. It is impossible to know where their main force is, or if there even is one. This was not war as the Wehrmacht understood it. German military doctrine was a science, a precise art of identifying the enemy's main point of effort, the Schwerpunkt, and crushing it with a concentrated, overwhelming counterblow. But how do you counterattack an enemy that has no center? How do you encircle a foe that is already behind your own lines, attacking not as a coherent body, but as thousands of individual angry cells? The reports flowing up to the headquarters of the German 7th Army were so contradictory, so utterly illogical, that they created a fatal paralysis. The German war machine, a magnificent instrument designed to fight a symphony of destruction, was being deafened by pure chaotic noise. Amidst this swirling vortex of confusion, one story rises above the din, an episode that perfectly encapsulates how American initiative turned a tactical disaster into a strategic masterpiece. It is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. A man known for his toughness and drive, Vandervoort was a paragon of the airborne ethos. But as he leaped into the flak-torn skies over Normandy, his personal war almost ended before it began. He landed hard in an apple orchard, and a sickening crack echoed in the night. His left ankle was shattered, the bone jutting grotesquely against the skin. For a paratroop commander, whose very job is to lead from the front, such an injury is a death sentence. Standard procedure demanded his evacuation. He was, by all military logic, out of the fight. But the logic of this night was being rewritten. As his scattered troopers began to find him, drawn by his voice in the darkness, Vandervoort made a decision that would become legend. He refused to be evacuated. He refused to relinquish command. He was the battalion's center of gravity, and he would not be moved. The mission, to seize the vital town of Sainte-Mère-Église, was all that mattered. He ordered his medics to ignore the break and simply lace his boot as tight as it would go, creating a crude, agonizing splint. Then, he had his men find him transportation. It came not in the form of a jeep or a half-track, but a rickety wooden farmer's cart. Propped up in this absurd makeshift chariot, gritting his teeth against waves of blinding pain, Vandervoort became a command post on wheels. As his battalion coalesced around him, he directed the assault on Sainte-Mère-Église, a battle that would become one of the most critical engagements of D-Day. Imagine the sight for the German defenders. They were being hit by a disciplined, coherent force, executing complex flanking maneuvers in the dark. They assumed they were facing a perfectly landed unit led by a commander in peak physical condition. They had no way of knowing that the architect of their destruction was a crippled man being pushed around in a cart, pointing out objectives with a swagger stick, his face pale with pain, but his voice an unwavering instrument of command. Later, when the cart broke, he was transferred to a wheelbarrow, continuing to direct the defense of the town against furious German counterattacks. Vandervoort's stand was more than just an act of incredible bravery. It was the living embodiment of the American doctrine that so baffled the Germans. His immobility forced him to practice the ultimate form of decentralized command, empowering his company and platoon leaders to act independently to achieve his intent. He could not lead the charge, so he became its brain and its will. His personal catastrophe should have decapitated his battalion. Instead, it became its rallying cry. The image of the colonel in the wheelbarrow, refusing to quit, transformed the chaos of the scattered drop into a single, unshakable point of resolve. The Germans were not just fighting men, they were fighting a spirit that simply did not conform to their understanding of warfare, a spirit that did not recognize failure and saw only the mission ahead. This spectacle of a crippled commander in a wheelbarrow, directing a battle that would shape the course of the invasion, is the perfect emblem of the night's impossible reality. A reality where every rule of war was shattered, and where a catastrophic failure of planning was somehow forged into a brilliant strategic success. It forces us to ask the central, overwhelming question of this entire investigation. How was this possible? How could the German war machine, the most professional and feared army in the world, be so completely and psychologically dismantled by what was, by every technical measure, a botched operation? The answer is as shocking as the event itself. Because just hours earlier, in the headquarters of Army Group B and the 7th Army, the mood was not one of alarm, but of relaxed, almost dismissive confidence. Their intelligence, their experience, their entire military doctrine told them that what was about to happen was a tactical absurdity. To understand this colossal failure of imagination, to grasp how an entire high command could be so blind to the nature of the threat coalescing in the darkness, we must pull back from the bloody hedgerows of Normandy and step into the mind of the German command itself. June 5th, 1944. The wind howls across the English Channel, whipping the sea into a slate-gray fury. At his headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel looks at the weather reports and nods with satisfaction. His meteorologists are certain the storm will hold for days. No sane commander would attempt an amphibious invasion in such conditions. Confident in nature's defenses, the Desert Fox makes a fateful decision. He climbs into his staff car to begin the long drive back to Germany. The next day is his wife's birthday, and he intends to be there to give her a pair of Parisian shoes. This single mundane act speaks louder than any strategic assessment. The invasion was not coming. Not now. This relaxed certainty permeated the entire German command structure. At the 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans, the Chief of Staff, General Max Pemsel, reviewed the day's intelligence summaries. They were blank. Allied air activity was minimal. Naval reconnaissance showed nothing. He remarked to a colleague planning a map exercise for the following day, "The Americans will not come in this weather. They are predictable. They require absolute air superiority and calm seas. This is not the weather for an invasion. It is the weather for staff games." And so, on the eve of the largest amphibious assault in human history, the German High Command in France was standing down. Key generals were scheduled to be away from their posts for a theoretical war game. The commander of the entire defensive sector was on the road for a family celebration. Their confidence was not born of ignorance, but of a cold, professional logic. A logic that was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. This confidence was not empty pride. It was the logical conclusion of 5 years of revolutionary warfare. The German officer corps saw themselves as the undisputed masters of the modern battlefield, and their experience gave them every reason to believe it. Their doctrine, Blitzkrieg, was not just a tactic. It was a philosophy, a symphony of coordinated arms that had shattered every opponent who clung to the static, predictable doctrines of the last war. From the plains of Poland to the coast of the English Channel, they had proven that speed, concentration of force, and decisive action were the keys to victory. Their entire plan for the defense of France, codified by Rommel himself, was a direct extension of this victorious doctrine. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel, was never intended to be an impenetrable barrier. It was a crust designed to slow the Allies down, to fix them in place for a few critical hours. The real killing blow was to be delivered by the panzer divisions held in reserve. The plan was a brutal calculus of time and force. Let the enemy establish a fragile beachhead, then unleash a perfectly timed armored counterthrust to drive them back into the sea before they could consolidate. It was the French campaign of 1940, writ large on the sands of Normandy. Within this framework, airborne troops were a known quantity. The Germans were, after all, the pioneers of large-scale airborne operations, having seized the Belgian fort of Eben Emmel and the island of Crete from the sky. They understood the role of the paratrooper, a specialist tool for seizing a specific high-value objective. They anticipated that the Allies would use them to capture bridges, silence key artillery batteries, or secure vital crossroads. These would be sharp, localized threats, dangerous, yes, but identifiable. And anything that could be identified could be isolated and destroyed by the disciplined German reserves. This doctrine, so effective and proven, had become a mental prison. It was a magnificent tool for solving a particular kind of problem, a conventional, structured war against a predictable enemy. The German generals were preparing flawlessly for the war they expected to fight. Their entire system was built to identify order and crush it. It never occurred to them that their true enemy was not an opposing order, but a force that would embrace and indeed weaponize chaos itself. The German analysis of their American adversary was meticulous, clinical, and fatally flawed. It was based not on propaganda, but on cold, hard data gleaned from the battlefields of the Mediterranean. Their primary case study was the Allied airborne assault on Sicily in July of 1943. To the German staff officers who dissected that operation, the results were almost comical. They saw an airborne force scattered over a 60-mile front, with entire planeloads of paratroopers dropped into the sea. They noted the heavy losses from friendly anti-aircraft fire and the near-total failure of units to land on their designated drop zones. To the German mind, this was not a new form of warfare. It was amateurism on a grand scale. Based on this evidence, German intelligence constructed a precise algebra of annihilation. They identified the handful of logical, high-value targets on the Cotentin Peninsula: the bridges, the major road junctions, the coastal batteries. They calculated the maximum number of paratroopers the Allies could land in a single lift. Then, they cross-referenced this with their observations from Sicily, applying a scatter coefficient which assumed a high degree of disorganization and loss upon landing. The conclusion was a mathematical certainty. Any Allied airborne force, even if it landed, would be a wounded and disoriented body, far from its objectives and incapable of unified action. The German response was therefore planned with surgical precision. Units like the battle-hardened 91st Air Landing Division were positioned as a rapid reaction force, a scalpel ready to excise the airborne infection before it could spread. The mathematics seemed unassailable. A few thousand disorganized American paratroopers, even if they were brave, would be no match for a coordinated counterattack by a German division. The American airborne divisions were, in the detached language of the German General Staff, a problem with a known solution. They were a tactical threat that would be neutralized within the first 6 hours of the invasion. Herein lay the fatal flaw, the monumental miscalculation at the heart of the entire German defensive plan. They had analyzed the enemy's previous failures and assumed they would be repeated. But they never asked the most critical question. What if that failure, that very chaos they were counting on, was not a weakness to be exploited, but an unintentional weapon of unimaginable power? Their entire strategy was designed to counter a concentrated, orderly assault. They had a plan to defeat the enemy's strength. They had no plan whatsoever to combat their weakness. And so, the German General Staff, having fed all the variables of experience, doctrine, and intelligence into their peerless analytical machine, arrived at a final, unequivocal verdict. An American airborne assault was not a strategic game-changer. It was a manageable problem. It was a predictable move on the great chessboard of war, a move for which they had a devastating and well-rehearsed countermove. The unbreakable equation of their planning was simple: Allied disorganization multiplied by a swift and concentrated German response equaled Allied annihilation. The phantom of an airborne invasion held no terror for them because they believed they had already dissected its soul and found it wanting. This conviction was best summarized in a final assessment given by General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army, on the eve of the invasion. When a junior officer raised the possibility of a large-scale but scattered nighttime drop, the general dismissed it with the cold logic of a master strategist. To disperse their elite forces across the entire peninsula without clear objectives, it would not be an invasion, it would be military suicide. Not even the Americans are that incompetent. He then delivered the final, fatal judgment, a conclusion that would echo with tragic irony in the coming dawn. A major airborne assault tonight is not just improbable, it is a tactical impossibility. But meanwhile, across the churning English Channel, the tactical impossibility was taking shape. On dozens of airfields shrouded in the damp English evening, the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were preparing for their rendezvous with destiny. There was no relaxed confidence here, only the focused, high-strung energy of a coiled spring. Young men with mohawk haircuts and faces blackened by burnt cork methodically checked and rechecked the crushing weight of their equipment. Each man was a walking arsenal, laden with not just his personal weapon, but extra ammunition, grenades, medical supplies, and rations. They were preparing not for a clean, surgical strike, but for a brawl in the dark, alone. The real American answer to the German doctrine, however, was not something that could be seen on a reconnaissance photograph. It was not a new type of plane or a more powerful bomb. It was a philosophy, an invisible weapon forged in the training grounds of America and England. While German doctrine emphasized the flawless execution of a centralized plan, the American airborne had been built around a radical principle: decentralized initiative. Every single soldier, from General Maxwell Taylor down to the lowest private, was briefed not just on his squad's specific task, but on the entire division's objectives. The mission was not, take this house. The mission was secure the causeways behind Utah Beach so the 4th Infantry Division can get inland. This seemingly small distinction was, in fact, a revolution. It meant that if a paratrooper was dropped 20 miles from his target, alone in the dark, he was not lost. He knew the overarching goal. His training dictated his actions: find other Americans, form an ad hoc unit, and begin attacking the enemy in pursuit of the larger mission. The plan was expected to fail. The initiative of the individual soldier was not. And they were given a simple, almost childish tool to facilitate this: a small metal cricket clicker. 1 click was a challenge, 2 clicks was the reply. It was a device designed not to transmit orders, but to create order from chaos, to allow 1,000 scattered points of light to find each other in the terrifying darkness. The Germans had analyzed the hardware, but they had completely missed the software. This difference in preparation reveals a chasm between two military philosophies, a fundamental disagreement about the very nature of war. The German way of war was a pursuit of perfection. It was an art form, like fine watchmaking, where every component was expertly crafted and assembled to work in perfect, intricate harmony. Their ideal battle was a masterpiece of planning and execution, a precisely controlled application of force directed from the top down. A German officer without orders would wait, because to act without a place in the grand design was to introduce a flaw, a discordant note in the symphony of battle. The system was designed to be magnificent in its coherence. The American airborne approach, by contrast, was an embrace of imperfection. If the German method was classical music, the American was jazz. It was built not on a rigid score, but on a simple, repeated theme: the mission objective. The generals who planned the drop, men like Matthew Ridgway and Maxwell Taylor, were not naive. They knew the hard lessons of Sicily. They knew the planes would be scattered by flak and weather. They knew the drop zones would be missed, units would be broken up, and leaders would be separated from their men. They didn't see this as a potential flaw in their plan. They saw it as the plan's inevitable starting condition. Their solution was not to try and create a more perfect plan, but to build an army that could thrive when the plan fell apart. They were not building a watch, they were building a swarm of hornets. The individual soldier was not a cog, but the primary strategic weapon. His orders were not a set of instructions, but a grant of authority. He was empowered to assess his local situation, find other Americans, and prosecute the war on his own terms. The chain of command was not a rigid hierarchy, but a fluid network that could reform spontaneously around any leader, regardless of his rank or unit. This was the true secret ingredient, the weapon the German intelligence officers could never diagram on a map. It was a profound and deeply cultural trust in the initiative of the common soldier. It was the belief that a lieutenant, a sergeant, or even a private, cut off from command and armed only with the knowledge of the overall objective, could be a more effective fighting force than a perfectly drilled company waiting for orders that would never come. They were not training men to follow a plan. They were training them to be the plan when everything else failed. The Germans, therefore, were preparing to fight an army. Instead, they were about to be hit by an idea that held that chaos was not a bug, but a feature. An idea that saw a scattered drop not as a failure of command, but as the successful distribution of thousands of individual, autonomous commanders across the entire depth of the battlefield. In the final days before the invasion, in a smoke-filled briefing room at Supreme Headquarters, the plan for the American airborne assault was laid bare. It was presented not as a clean set of battle lines, but as a calculated risk of staggering proportions. On the vast maps covering the walls, the drop zones were neat, tidy circles. But everyone in the room knew that on the night of the invasion, those circles would bleed into a chaotic, unpredictable smear across the entire Cotentin Peninsula. The plan was not to deliver 2 divisions to a specific point. It was to hurl 18,000 men into the dark heart of the German defenses. The voice of conventional military wisdom and the source of profound skepticism belonged to the British Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the commander of the Allied Expeditionary Air Forces. He was a man who thought in terms of logistics and probabilities, and the numbers he presented were chilling. He pointed to the inexperience of the transport pilots, the ferocity of the German anti-aircraft defenses, and the unpredictable weather. His conclusion was not a caution. It was a prophecy of doom. He looked General Eisenhower in the eye and predicted that the airborne assault would result in casualties of 70%. 80% of the gliders, he argued, would be lost before they even reached their landing zones. It would be, he stated flatly, a futile slaughter. Against this terrifyingly rational assessment stood the American airborne commanders, Matthew Ridgway and Maxwell Taylor. They did not dispute Leigh-Mallory's data. They did not promise a perfect drop. Instead, they made a counter-argument that seemed to defy military logic. They argued that the very scattering Leigh-Mallory feared was their greatest weapon. Their men, they insisted, were not automatons who would cease to function if separated from their officers. They were trained to be leaders themselves. The Germans were expecting a spearhead. They would give them a shotgun blast. A perfect, concentrated drop would be identified and annihilated. A scattered, chaotic drop would paralyze the German command, turning every field and village into a battlefield and making a coordinated response impossible. The final decision rested on the shoulders of one man, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He listened to Leigh-Mallory's cold mathematics of slaughter. He listened to Ridgway's passionate faith in the initiative of his soldiers. He was being asked to make a pact with chaos, to wager thousands of lives on a doctrine that had never been tested on this scale. The silence in the room was absolute as he weighed the certain risk against the potential reward. Then, with a quiet finality, he gave his verdict. The airborne assault would go forward as planned. It was not a moment of triumphant confidence, but of grim, sober resolve. The creators of this miracle were acutely aware that they might be orchestrating a catastrophe, a truth Eisenhower privately acknowledged by drafting a short press release in his own hand, taking full and sole responsibility should the landings fail. Just after midnight, the air over the English coast thrummed with the sound of 800 C-47 Skytrains lumbering into the night sky. Inside these vibrating aluminum shells, the paratroopers were packed shoulder to shoulder, a silent, grim-faced cargo heading towards a storm of both weather and steel. As the vast formation crossed the channel, the neat, disciplined lines began to fray. Thick cloud banks, unanticipated in their intensity, forced pilots to break formation. Then came the German flak, a sudden, terrifying eruption of tracer fire that ripped through the darkness, turning the air into a deadly, incandescent garden. Pilots swerved and dove, their primary concern shifting from navigation to survival. The great iron serpent of the air armada was being chopped into 100 disconnected pieces. On the ground, the first sightings were treated not with alarm, but with a kind of professional contempt. A German anti-aircraft crew near Cherbourg reported a lone transport plane, flying too low and too fast, releasing its dolls miles from any conceivable target. The report was logged as another example of Allied incompetence. In a field miles to the south, a German patrol stumbled upon a single American paratrooper whose equipment was hopelessly entangled in the branches of an oak tree. They captured him easily. He seemed confused, lost, and alone. He was not a threat. He was a symptom of a failed plan. These first signals began to trickle into the headquarters of the 7th Army. The teletype machines chattered sporadically, printing out disjointed fragments of information. Enemy parachutists sighted near Montebourg. Report of 3 gliders down east of the Meurthe River. Dummy parachutists deployed with firecrackers to simulate battle. To General Max Pemsel, the Chief of Staff, these reports were not painting a picture of an invasion, but of a nuisance raid. They were precisely the kind of diversionary tactics one would expect before a main assault elsewhere, perhaps at Calais. He coolly assessed the situation and relayed his now infamous verdict to his superiors. The reports received so far do not suggest a large-scale operation. This was the moment the German war machine began to bleed out, not from a single, massive wound, but from 1,000 tiny, unperceived cuts. While Pemsel was calmly reassuring his commanders, the reality on the ground was metastasizing. The lone paratrooper in the tree was not an anomaly. He was one of thousands. The scattered sticks of men were not lost. They were linking up in the darkness, whispering challenges and clicking their metal crickets. One of these small, ad hoc groups was, at that very moment, setting up an ambush on the road leading from the command post of General Wilhelm Falley, commander of the 91st Division. The ticking time bomb was not the planes in the air, it was the growing chasm between German perception and the lethal reality coalescing in every ditch and hedgerow. The chaos they had dismissed as incompetence was already beginning to strangle them. Now, with the German High Command's confident illusions laid bare and the American philosophy of chaos established, we can finally look at the raw, brutal mathematics of what happened in the skies over Normandy. By any conventional military yardstick, Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory's darkest prophecies had come true. The operation was a catastrophe written in the language of statistics. Of the more than 6,600 men of the 101st Airborne, only 1,100 had been gathered into organized units by dawn. The rest were scattered to the winds. The division's carefully prepared equipment bundles, containing vital mortars, machine guns, and radios, suffered a staggering loss rate of over 70%. One stick of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne was dropped a full 20 miles from its target, an error so profound it was literally off the tactical map. But this is where the story pivots from a tale of failure to a lesson in a new kind of warfare. That very statistical chaos, which should have guaranteed defeat, became the algebraic equation of victory. The Germans were prepared for 1, 2, maybe 3 major incursions. What they got was something for which no doctrine existed. The men of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, who were supposed to land on a single drop zone, were instead found on every single drop zone used that night, and dozens of places in between. This meant that instead of one significant threat to track, German headquarters was suddenly receiving hundreds of independent, simultaneous reports of enemy contact from across a battle space of 75 square miles. It was a military nervous system being overwhelmed, a map being turned into an incomprehensible blizzard of enemy sightings. And within this blizzard of randomness, chaos produced a single, statistically miraculous bullseye that was more effective than any planned strike could ever have been. A small, lost group of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne, miles from their objective, happened to land near the Chateau de Berneville, the headquarters of the German 91st Division. As its commander, General Wilhelm Falley, rushed from the chateau towards his command post to organize the counterattack, he drove straight into their impromptu ambush. In a brief, violent firefight, the the general was killed. With that one random act, born of a navigational error, the primary German counterattack force in the entire sector was decapitated. For the most crucial first hours of the invasion, the 91st Division was rendered leaderless and inert. The shotgun blast into the dark had by pure chance severed the enemy's brainstem. This statistical paralysis of the German command reveals a profound systemic gulf between the two combatants. It was a collision of military worlds. Consider the fundamental unit of action, the junior officer. A German lieutenant, cut off from his company, was conditioned by his training to do one thing: hold his position and await orders. His primary duty was to the integrity of the plan, to his place in the larger, exquisitely designed machine. To act independently was to risk disrupting a symphony he could not fully perceive. The system was paramount. The individual was a component. His American counterpart in the same situation operated under a diametrically opposed philosophy. He was not an executor of a plan, he was the plan's emergency generator. His doctrine, drilled into him relentlessly, was that the absence of orders was, in itself, an order to take initiative. He was expected to assess the situation, gather any nearby troops regardless of their unit, and immediately begin prosecuting the overall mission objective as he saw fit. If the lieutenant was killed, this responsibility passed seamlessly to the platoon sergeant, then to a squad leader, then to any private who had the courage to step up. The system was designed to be disposable. The individual was the failsafe. This philosophical divide shaped the very texture of the combat. The Germans, peering into the Norman darkness, were searching for a front line, a Hauptkampflinie which they could probe, fix, and assault with their proven combined arms tactics. But the Americans gave them no such line. They created a 360-degree battlefield, a lethal patchwork where a German machine gun crew clearing a field might suddenly take fire from the very hedgerow they had passed moments before. The German soldier was fighting a conventional battle. The American paratrooper was fighting a survivalist war of ambush and attrition. Consequently, the intelligence systems of the two armies broke down in completely different ways. The German command post was an eye trying to focus on a landscape that had dissolved into 1,000 disconnected points of light and shadow. It was drowning in data it could not synthesize into a coherent picture. The American intelligence system, in these first hours, was brutally simple and effective. It existed entirely within the mind of the individual squad leader. His intelligence was the muzzle flash he saw from the next hedgerow. His operational map was the 50 yards of field he needed to cross. While the German generals stared at their maps in confusion, the American paratroopers were creating a new map, written in blood and cordite, one small firefight at a time. What was truly colliding in the fields and villages of Normandy was not merely two armies, but two industrial-age civilizations with fundamentally different views on the relationship between man and system. The German way of war was the final, brilliant expression of the 19th century Prussian ideal. The state as a flawless machine, with the soldier as its perfectly calibrated gear. The American response was a product of the New World frontier, a chaotic, individualistic ethos that held that the most valuable asset in any crisis was not the plan, but the ingenuity of the person on the ground when the plan inevitably went wrong. The German high command was desperately trying to quantify the threat, but they were counting the wrong things. They were counting divisions, battalions, and companies, because that was the grammar of war as they knew it. But the American airborne was no longer a division. It had become a plague of firefights. It was not one large enemy force. It was 1,000 microscopic ones, each one acting with its own will and intent. For every report of a platoon-sized engagement at a crossroads, there were 10 other unreported skirmishes happening simultaneously in orchards, barns, and ditches across the peninsula. This was the weapon of abundance, not of men or material, but of initiative. The American airborne doctrine was, in effect, an industrial system for manufacturing chaos. It took 18,000 men and, through the violent catalyst of a scattered drop, transformed them into several hundred autonomous, self-directed combat cells. Each cell was a factory producing its own tactical problems for the Germans. One group would cut a communications wire, another would ambush a dispatch rider. A third would open fire on a supply truck, forcing a whole column to halt and deploy. None of these actions were decisive on their own, but in their crushing abundance, they created a total systemic failure of the German response. The German method of war was an exquisite craft. It was the art of bringing a perfectly forged hammer down on a single, well-defined anvil. Now, they found themselves trying to smash a swarm of wasps with that same hammer. It was a maddening, exhausting exercise in futility. A German infantry company would spend an hour meticulously clearing a hedgerow of a handful of stubborn paratroopers, only to advance 50 yards and be ambushed from the flank by a completely different group. One German officer's report from the battle for the Lafayette Causeway captured the psychological toll. We cannot advance. Every time we eliminate a pocket of resistance, another appears behind us. There is no front, there is no rear. We are not fighting an army, we are fighting ghosts who bleed. This was the moment the war ceased to be a simple contest of arms and became a competition of systems. The German system, for all its tactical brilliance, was doctrinally bankrupt in the face of this assault. It was designed to process one major threat at a time. The American system, though seemingly inefficient and wasteful, had a production capacity for tactical threats that was beyond anything the Germans could counter. They were being defeated not by a superior strategy, but by a superior rate of production of chaos itself. On the night of June 6th, the Wehrmacht discovered that it was possible to lose a war not because your enemy was stronger, but because he was simply everywhere. Dawn, June 6th. A gray, watery light seeps into the command bunker of the German 7th Army. With it comes the news they have been waiting for. The seaborne invasion has begun. The first waves of American infantry are hitting the beaches codenamed Utah. For the German officers, this is the moment of clarity, the signal to unleash the well-rehearsed counterstroke. The plan is simple, elegant, and brutal. The 91st Air Landing Division, positioned inland, will immediately storm the causeways leading from the beach, pinning the Americans in their narrow lodgment while the Panzer Reserves are called up to deliver the killing blow. The orders are given. The machine is activated. And then, nothing. An unnerving silence answers their commands. Communications with the 91st Division headquarters are sporadic, then cut entirely. Frantic calls to its commander, General Falley, go unanswered. Simultaneously, a new wave of reports begins to flood the command post, no longer disjointed sightings, but terrifyingly specific messages from units near the coast. Causeway at Poupeville is blocked by heavy enemy resistance, unable to advance towards Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Road held by American paratroopers. Lafayette Bridge is in enemy hands. They are dug in. General Pemsel stands before the grand tactical map, the one that only hours before had been a source of such confidence. The pins and markers representing the scattered airborne drops are no longer random ink blots. A horrifying logic is beginning to emerge. The pins are not scattered randomly at all. They form a perfect, suffocating constellation around the very arteries the German counterattack depends on. The Americans had not missed their targets. Their target was the entire German response system. The failed drop had placed them not on top of a few key bridges, but on every key bridge, every crossroads, every vital pathway leading from the interior to the beach. A cold dread settles over the room, the kind of intellectual fear that is worse than any physical threat. The officers stare at the map, and the map stares back, revealing the full, catastrophic scale of their miscalculation. The Americans had not committed military suicide, as General Dahlmann had so confidently predicted. They had performed a brilliant, if perhaps unintentional, act of strategic jiu-jitsu. They had used the German army's own strength, its reliance on a swift, coordinated armored response, against it. They had not built a wall to stop the panzers, they had simply cut all the roads. In that moment, General Pemsel understood. The thousands of individual firefights, the reports of chaos and confusion, were not the symptoms of a failed invasion. They were the invasion. The Americans had not landed an army, they had injected a virus directly into the German central nervous system, paralyzing it before the battle had even truly begun. The phrase Pemsel had uttered just hours ago does not suggest a large-scale operation now hung in the air, a bitter epitaph for a world of military certainty that had just vanished forever. By the evening of June 6th, the initial fog of war had lifted from the German command posts, only to be replaced by the choking smoke of a burning doctrine. The piecemeal counterattacks had failed, swallowed by the Norman countryside. The Panzer Reserves, the great hammer of the Reich, remained paralyzed by a combination of Allied air power and command indecision. The battle was less than 24 hours old, But for the commanders on the ground, a lifetime of military certainty had already been consumed. They were now conducting an intellectual autopsy on their own defeat, even as the fighting raged around them. The clearest and most damning verdict came not from a panicked staff officer, but from one of the Wehrmacht's most respected and experienced commanders, General Erich Marx, head of the 84th Corps. Marx was a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had witnessed the brutal, grinding warfare of Russia and understood ferocity in its purest form. He was not a man given to hyperbole or alarmism. His reports were known for their cold, unflinching clarity. As the reports from the Cotentin Peninsula filled his headquarters, he saw a pattern that chilled him more than any Soviet massed infantry assault. Late that evening, in a signal to the 7th Army headquarters, General Marx delivered the formal admission of defeat. It was not a surrender of arms, but something far more profound, a surrender of understanding. He wrote, "The paratroopers are fighting with a tenacity and ferocity that I have not seen since the Russian front." This alone was a stunning comparison, equating the elite American airborne with the fanatical defenders of Stalingrad. But it was his next words that constituted the true epitaph for the German way of war. They are everywhere. It is impossible to get a clear picture. Every hedgerow is a small front. This was the moment of catharsis. In that single, concise phrase, "Every hedgerow is a small front," Marx articulated the collapse of an entire military philosophy. The German doctrine of the Schwerpunkt, the concentrated point of effort, was meaningless against an enemy who created 1,000 points of effort simultaneously. Their art of a decisive, centralized battle was useless against a foe who refused to offer them a center of gravity to attack. It was a confession that the war had become formless, that the enemy was not an army to be fought, but a condition to be endured, like a fever. Marx's dispatch was more than an intelligence report. It was a white flag raised over a worldview. It was the voice of the master craftsman admitting that his intricate tools were useless for working with this new, strange material. The Americans had not simply defeated German units, they had defeated German logic. And in the mind of a German general, the loss of logic, the loss of a clear, ordered understanding of the battlefield, was the ultimate and most terrifying form of defeat. In the days that followed D-Day, the German High Command, finally grasping the terrifying nature of the new battlefield, desperately tried to adapt. They attempted to create a response to this American-made chaos, to impose their sense of order on a war that refused to be ordered. Their solution, born of desperation, was to create their own small, mobile battle groups, or Kampfgruppen. These ad hoc units, combining infantry, armor, and artillery, were designed to be fast-moving, flexible forces that could hunt down and destroy the isolated pockets of American paratroopers. This was a moment of profound, almost tragic irony. In their attempt to fight the American swarm, the Germans were forced to abandon their own grand doctrine of the single, decisive blow and imitate the very tactics of their enemy. They were breaking down their magnificent, centralized war machine into smaller, more agile components, tacitly admitting that the American model was the only one that could function in the dense, suffocating terrain of the Normandy hedgerows. The masters of Blitzkrieg were now being forced to learn the art of the street brawl. But the attempt was doomed from the start. The German army was a fundamentally top-down organization. A Kampfgruppe commander, for all his supposed autonomy, was still culturally and doctrinally bound to the chain of command. He still requested permission, waited for coordinated fire support, and sought to create a defined front line. He was playing jazz, but he was still reading from a sheet of classical music. The American paratroopers, by contrast, had chaos in their DNA. They did not need to be taught how to fight in small, isolated groups. It was their natural state of being. The failure of the Kampfgruppen was a lesson in the difference between a tactic and a philosophy. The Germans could copy the American formation, but they could not replicate the American mindset. They could not simply issue an order to take more initiative. That quality was the product of a different culture, a different set of assumptions about the individual's role in the collective. They found themselves in a race they were guaranteed to lose. For every German battle group they managed to organize and dispatch, the Americans were spontaneously creating a dozen smaller, faster, and more ruthless versions of the same thing. Trying to counter the American chaos was like trying to scoop up mercury with a fork. The harder they tried to contain it, the more it fragmented and slipped through their fingers. The battle for Normandy was more than a contest of arms. It was a violent collision of national mythologies. For over a decade, the National Socialist regime had meticulously constructed the myth of the new German man, the soldat. He was portrayed not merely as a soldier, but as the pinnacle of human development, disciplined, fearless, ideologically pure, and an extension of the state's unbending will. The Wehrmacht was the ultimate expression of this creed, a perfect hierarchical machine, beautiful in its lethal order. This myth was the ideological bedrock of the Third Reich, a source of profound strength and unshakable self-belief. In the Hedgerows, this myth died a slow, agonizing death. The German soldier, trained to see himself as the apex predator of the battlefield, was being hunted and dismantled by an enemy who seemed to embody everything he was taught to despise. The American paratrooper was not the product of a rigid top-down system. He was individualistic, often insubordinate, and fighting with a kind of chaotic frontier resourcefulness. The German soldier waited for orders from a lieutenant he could not find. The American private became the lieutenant. Every German instinct screamed that this was amateurish, undisciplined, and wrong. And yet, it was working. This created a profound psychological crisis, a form of intellectual vertigo from which the German command never recovered. It is one thing to be defeated by overwhelming numbers or a brilliant textbook maneuver. It is another thing entirely to be defeated by what your entire worldview defines as incompetence. It was the ultimate humiliation, the master strategist being checkmated by a player who appeared to be knocking over the pieces at random. The very success of the American chaos was a refutation of the German obsession with order. It suggested that their entire philosophy of war, and by extension, their philosophy of life, was built on a fragile and false foundation. The true decisive factor on D-Day, therefore, was not a piece of technology, but an idea. The myth of the perfectly ordered superior man was shattered by the reality of the adaptable, individualistic one. The ultimate weapon was not the M1 Garand rifle, but the decentralization of thought itself. The American airborne operation proved that a system designed to function in chaos could be more resilient and ultimately more lethal than a system designed to achieve perfection. What collapsed in Normandy was not just a front line, but a faith. The Hedgerows became the graveyard of a god, and the soldiers who had worshipped him were left to fight on in a world that no longer made any sense. The echoes of that chaotic night in Normandy did not fade with the end of the war. They became a foundational text for a new kind of military thought. The hard-won lesson of the airborne assault, that a force designed to thrive in chaos will defeat a force designed for perfect order, became the organizing principle for the West's most elite military formations. The operational DNA of units like the U.S. Army's Green Berets and the Navy SEALs is a direct inheritance from the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st. Their entire philosophy is built on the concept of the small, autonomous team, empowered to operate independently deep within enemy territory, guided not by constant radio commands, but by a deep understanding of the mission's ultimate intent. Every time a Special Forces operator makes a critical decision alone, miles from support, he is channeling the spirit of a paratrooper who found himself in a dark field in 1944 and chose to attack. But the most profound and surprising legacy of this weaponized chaos rippled far beyond the battlefield. It became a ghostly, unacknowledged blueprint for success in the complex systems of the post-war world. The rigid, top-down, hierarchical command structure of the German Wehrmacht had its civilian counterpart in the great industrial behemoths of the Old World. These were organizations built on precision, predictability, and the flawless execution of a central plan. They were, in their own way, magnificent machines. Yet, the future belonged to a different model. The explosive growth of Silicon Valley and the modern tech industry is, in a strange sense, the story of the Normandy airborne drop retold in the language of business. The most innovative companies are not those with the most rigid 5-year plans, but those who empower small, agile teams to experiment, to fail, and to adapt. The concept of commander's intent has been reborn as the company mission statement, a guiding principle that allows for decentralized innovation. The lone paratrooper, forming an ad hoc squad to attack a new target of opportunity, is the spiritual ancestor of the startup engineer, pivoting a project in response to an unexpected breakthrough. Both are expressions of the same fundamental truth. In a rapidly changing and chaotic environment, the most resilient system is not the strongest, but the most adaptable. This principle extends even further into the very way we manage modern crises. From disaster response to network security, we have learned the painful lesson that centralized control is often a brittle illusion. The first moments of any catastrophe, be it a hurricane or a cyber attack, are defined by chaos. The most effective responses are almost always born from the bottom up, from the initiative of the first responders on the scene who understand the local reality far better than any distant command center ever could. And so we arrive at the central, enduring lesson of this entire conflict, the moral of a story written in the blood and courage of 18,000 men. The German High Command fell victim to a fatal intellectual error, a form of hubris that is as tempting today as it was then. They believed that with enough planning, enough discipline, and enough intelligence, they could master the chaos of war. They constructed a perfect, logical machine to impose their will upon the world. But war, like life itself, is not a machine. It is a complex, adaptive system, and in such a system, the obsession with perfect order is a fatal weakness. The American airborne, through a combination of design, accident, and sheer willpower, became the embodiment of a new paradigm. They were not a perfect machine, they were a resilient organism. Here, then, is the ultimate truth revealed on that June morning. Victory does not always belong to the side with the most brilliant plan. It belongs to the side whose people can become the plan when everything else has fallen to pieces. The great contest of the 20th century was not just one of ideologies or economies, but of systems. And on D-Day, in the hedgerows of Normandy, the organism devoured the machine. In the days and weeks that followed, as the battle for Normandy ground on, the full measure of the new reality settled upon the German army. The men captured in those first hours were not defiant, they were profoundly bewildered. American interrogators noted a common theme running through their testimonies, a sense of having been overwhelmed not by mass, but by an unnerving, formless ubiquity. They had been trained to fight a solid, tangible enemy, but had instead been swarmed by a mist that carried knives. This shared bewilderment was best captured not in a high-level strategic analysis, but in the exhausted words of a captured German captain. Staring blankly at his interrogator, he tried to explain the inexplicable, to give voice to the intellectual vertigo that had shattered his professional world. His question was not a tactical inquiry, it was a philosophical surrender. These Americans, he said, they are misdropped, leaderless, and fighting in every direction. How can we possibly fight a force that has no front, no rear, and no flanks? In that single, desperate question lies the entire story. The German army, the most formidable instrument of conventional war ever created, had come to Normandy prepared to fight an army. Instead, they found themselves at war with a storm. And one cannot draw a front line against a hurricane.